Hello, friends. All right. I think we're up and running. Hello, I'm seeing people in the chat already. Yay. Hi, friends. I see Julia and Nikki and Robin and Sydney. Yay. Awesome. Good to see y'all. If you're here and you haven't said hey in the chat, go ahead, because we like to know who's here and then we can hang out and talk. Oh, there's Carolyn. Good. Good to see ya. Well, welcome to another hot and sweaty night in Minnesota. It's actually not as hot as it has been, so I'm thankful for that. Hi, Jude and Stephanie and Ellis. Yay! Awesome. Good to see you all. So I think we're here. I think we're good. I think we're ready to get going. I'm happy to see you all and happy to be talking about this very cool story. Tonight, in case you didn't get the memo or didn't see, we are talking about the story of, I always want to say the story of Deborah, but it's really the story of Deborah and Barak and Sisera and Jael and Heber and like some other people. There's a lot of people in this story, and saying that it's just Deborah's story, I think, is kind of doing it a disservice. It's a really good story, but it's also a kind of a complicated story. There's a lot of violence. If you want I think a movie version of this particular story would look a lot like The Two Towers, like the middle Lord of the Rings film, where it's just like a battle the whole time. But it's really interesting. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of cool characters. So I'm excited to read it all with you. This story that we're going to be reading and talking about is in Judges chapter 4 and 5. And so here's the first interesting thing about this story we're going to be looking at. That is, there's two sort of, chapters 4 and 5 are two sort of tellings of this same story. And it's like one story, the story that we're going to read in Judges chapter 4 is a narrative version, and then Judges chapter 5 is a song version. So it's like the prose story in chapter 4 and then the poetry story in chapter 5. And what we think about these two stories, we think that the song version, what you'll find in Judges chapter 5, is actually the older version of this story, that the song was like around for a long time, and then Judges chapter 4 was written to kind of like fill in the gaps, to be like, okay, everybody knows the old song, but like what actually happened? So that's what we think is going on with having these two versions of the story in 4 and 5. They don't disagree. It's not like one version is saying something that another version isn't really. It's just that the song is a little bit bare bones, and so they kind of fleshed it out with Judges chapter 4. So that's what we're going to be reading tonight. Hi, Mary. Good to see you. So that's what we're going to be reading. We're going to be reading the Judges chapter 4 version of this story, the narrative version, and then we might, mention bits of chapter 5, but really we're going to be reading chapter 4. So let me put our text up for you. There we go. We're reading all of Judges chapter 4, but it's only 24 verses, so it's not, a lot happens for it not being that many verses. So if you have a Bible nearby and you want to pick it up and find yourself Judges chapter 4, it's like the 6th book? Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, 7th book. Yes, it's the 7th book in the Bible, in the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, so it's going to be towards the front of your Bible. If you're looking for a place to read this chapter online, I'm going to put a link in the chat right now. Ta-da! On Bible Gateway, and Bible Gateway is helpful because 1, it's free, and 2, you can have so many different kinds, so many different translations that you can use. So as per usual, I'm going to be reading the New Revised Standard Version, so that is the version that I'm going to be reading. But as always, if you are reading a different version and you're like, hey, wait a minute, that word was like super different and I wonder why, let us know in the chat, because translation differences are always fascinating, and I probably won't have an answer for you about why it is the way it is, but we might have some thoughts. So let us know if you see something like that happen. So I'm going to go ahead and we're going to start by reading verses 1 through Where should we stop here? Let's read verses 1 through 10, and we're going to just start with the first 10 verses, and then we're going to pause for a second and talk a little bit about what's going on. So, verses 1 through 10 is what we're going to be looking at to start us off. So I will read this for us. So it goes like this. You know what? Maybe even before I read verse 1, I'm pausing for a second because I'm realizing we should talk a little bit about the what's happening. We need to talk about the context of what's happening, because the very first verse, if you are reading the first verse, the very first verse says, the Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud died. And so you're like being thrown into the story, just tossed in, like, good luck figuring out what's going on. So let's talk for a second about what's happening prior to this story. So the book of Judges is a book about the many times the Israelites, they've like come to the promised land, right? God rescued them from Egypt. They wander in the desert. They finally get to the promised land, and they're in the promised land, but they keep screwing up. And this is like before they've like built, before they've completely built up what will become the kingdom of Israel. It's before that. They keep screwing up. And what I mean by screwing up, when it says they did evil in the sight of the Lord, what that's referencing is they were worshiping other gods. So basically the same thing happens over and over in the book of Judges, and it goes like this. It goes, the people end up worshiping another god, and God gets mad about it, and so God lets something bad happen to them, and then the Israelites are sorry for screwing up, and they say, God, this really sucks, help, and God brings a new leader, and the leader helps to free them, and then they just do the same thing over again, and they worship a different god again. So it's the same cycle that happens over and over throughout this whole book. So like the Israelites screw up, and so then God brings Deborah, right? Deborah frees everybody, and then they're all good, and then they screw up again, and God raises up Gideon, who's another judge, right? And the same thing happens with Samson. So like the same thing, the same cycle happens throughout the book of Judges, which is kind of a bummer to read, like, come on, y'all get it together. But we are human, and we do tend to make the same mistakes over and over for a long time before we figure it out. So, some of it's just being human. So, in this first part of the book of Judges, because we're only in chapter 4, the Israelites have done this already, where they've screwed up one time, and God has been like, okay, cool, rescuing you, putting you back, giving you a good judge. And that previous judge, his name was Ehud, right? So that's the person who's noted here in verse 1. So that's kind of where we're setting things up, is the Israelites were fine for a little while, but then their leader died and they started screwing up again. So now that we've got some background, let's read verses 1 through 10. The Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud died. So the Lord sold them into the hand of King Jabin of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. The commander of his army was Sisera, who lived in Harosheth Hagoyim. Then the Israelites cried out to the Lord for help, for he had 900 chariots of iron, and he had oppressed the Israelites cruelly for 20 years. At that time, Deborah, a prophetess, wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel. She used to sit under the palm of Deborah, between Ramah and Bethel, in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites came up to her for judgment. She sent and summoned Barak, son of Abinoam, from Kadesh in Naphtali, and said to him, the Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go take a position at Mount Tabor. Bring 10,000 from the tribe of Naphtali and the tribe of Zebulun. I will draw out Sisera, the general of Jabin's army, to meet you by the Wadi Kishon with his chariots and his troops, and I will give him into your hand. Barak said to her, if you will go with me, I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. And she said, sure, I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. Then Deborah got up and went with Barak to Kadesh. Barak summoned Zebulun and Naphtali to Kadesh, and 10,000 warriors went up behind him, and Deborah went up with him. So, that's our introduction to the the story here. Is like, this is the introduction to the battle. Bluefoot, I'm sorry that you missed the start. I was just giving some background, but you'll get it. You'll get into it. So we've got these first 10 verses, and a lot happens. So I want to take it and talk about some little interesting things that happen in this verse. The whole reason that I brought up Deborah as our sort of main character for the story tonight is because Deborah does some things that bend gender roles for women. And one of them is being a leader of Israel. Deborah is the only female leader of the Israelites. And she is brought up by God. God sort of appoints her as the leader. So, some interesting linguistic stuff here for you that you might find interesting, or you might not. Let it fall off your back if you don't like it. Couple things. First of all, I love the fact that when it says Deborah, at the time Deborah, a prophetess, wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel. Here's a fun fact about Lapidoth, right? Lapidoth is supposedly her husband, right? Wife of Lapidoth. But the interesting thing is Lapidoth is not a common name. It's not really, it's not a name we ever hear again. It's also a weird thing because it's got a feminine ending to it. And so some people have said, perhaps this wasn't actually the name of a person that Deborah was married to, because the word for wife and woman are basically the same. So it could be woman of something rather than wife of something. So when you translate Lapidoth as just like a word and not as a name, it means of torches. So some translators over the years have said, maybe Deborah is not the wife of Lapidoth, maybe she's Deborah, the woman of torches. And we have no idea what that means. And we don't know, really if that's there's no correct way to translate that because we don't know who Lapidoth was or if he existed. But we do know that the language here is a little bit weird. And so I kind of like thinking about Deborah as the woman of torches because, she is basically leading this army. So anyways, cool linguistic thing, a little bit of Hebrew fun to start you off tonight. The other thing to notice about Deborah is that you'll notice, this is the book of Judges, right? So theoretically, all these stories are about the judges of Israel. The word judge in Hebrew doesn't just mean somebody who judges things like a judge today. It also essentially translates to chieftain or a leader that also is a war leader, basically. So all of that is wrapped up in the one word, in the one Hebrew word. So most of the time when we get judges in the book of Judges, for instance, Samuel, like I said, Gideon, like I said, Ehud before this, they're all talked about as a judge or this chieftain with this Hebrew word. And they all do lead armies than they do fight, right? The interesting thing about Deborah, one of the interesting things about Deborah, is that she's not actually called a judge. She's not actually given that particular title. What you notice in that verse 4, it says, at the time Deborah, a prophetess, wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel. She's not given the title of judge or chieftain or war leader. She is a prophet, a female prophet, who does the judging. So judging is the verb. It's not the word it's not like her title. So why is that important? Why is it important that she does judging and does chieftaining rather than being a chieftain or being a judge? Well, the answer basically is patriarchy. The answer is the fact that according to the sort of understanding of gender at this time in Israel, women couldn't be military leaders. That wasn't a thing they were allowed to be. And so calling Deborah a chieftain or a judge that had those military underpinnings would have seemed not proper for a woman to be called something like that. So instead she's called the prophetess who judges Israel. So getting a little linguistic loophole in there for Deborah. So this all kind of leads us to the question, why weren't women allowed to be military leaders? What, were they allowed to fight? What was going on there? And this connects to a verse that is often, interpretations of a verse that is often used against trans folks. So again, just pulling in those gender strings here. So the verse that I'm talking about is Deuteronomy 22:5, which if you're in our Transmission Ministry Collective Discord group, we are actually talking about that verse this week, talking about different interpretations of that verse. But basically, the verse says, men shall not wear women's clothes, and women shall not wear men's clothes. And that's the verse, right? Deuteronomy 22:5. And for some people, they've interpreted that as all clothes, all clothes, everyday clothes, right? Any clothes. Women can't wear men's clothes, men can't wear women's clothes, period. So that's a verse that's been used against trans folks and been used against cis women as well. For a long time, that verse was the reason why cis women weren't allowed to wear pants and had to wear dresses and skirts. So like, it's not been just used against trans folks. But that verse about clothing is sometimes interpreted to be about clothing in general. But there have been certain interpretations over time that has seen that verse not as being about clothing in general, but as specifically about clothing related to war and battle. So I'm going to read you a quote here. This is a quote from the, there it is. It's from Abraham ibn Ezra's, Abraham ibn Ezra was a Jewish commentary writer, writing around a little bit after 1000 BCE, 1000 CE. So this is about, if you think about it in terms of like the BC or AD type of timekeeping, this is about 1,000 years after Jesus' life, right? So that's where this commentary is coming from. But ancient Jewish commentary tried to sort of reflect on what was going on with the original writers of the text. And so Abraham ibn Ezra, when he was looking at Deuteronomy 22:5, he said, this passage, Deuteronomy 22:5, dealing with the attire of a man is juxtaposed to passages dealing with going out to war. So he's noticing that near around this particular verse, there are some bits about war. And he says, those things are put there because women were created to rear children, and if she were instead to go out among the men to war, she would eventually become involved in debauchery. So this particular commentary writer, writing around 1000 CE, is saying, like, this isn't just about everyday clothing. This was specifically about certain kinds of clothing, battle clothing, and then there are other commentary writers who think it's also about ritual clothing for things like sacrifice. So, to put all this together, to sort of draw all these strings together, some people think that the whole reason that women in ancient Israel weren't allowed to do things like go into battle was because of verses like this around clothing. Sure, you could go into battle without armor on, but you'd probably die quicker, right? So if you're not allowed to wear armor, you then kind of can't go into battle. So that's kind of the situation that we think we have here. Why Deborah is sort of kept from being the military leader in the text that we seem to think that she might be. So there's Deborah. That's a little bit that I want to put it out there. So I see Sydney and Mary are kind of calling it on the sexism and the patriarchy thing going on here. Yeah, basically the rule was, if you can't wear these certain kinds of clothing, then you can't go do these certain activities, very conveniently. So that's kind of where we are with Deborah. And so we've got Deborah. She's sitting under the palm of Deborah. She's got a whole tree named after her. And she hears from God that God is going to help liberate the Israelites from the oppression of this cruel king, this cruel Canaanite king. If you were reading this story and you're like, this reminds me of something, and you think of the story of the Exodus from Egypt, there's a very similar kind of deal here, where the Israelites, in verse 3, it says, the Israelites cried out to the Lord for help, for this king of Canaan had 900 chariots and had oppressed the Israelites cruelly for 20 years. So there's a lot going on here that's similar to what happened in Egypt, right? The Israelites cried out to God in Egypt, and God answered by sending a leader. The same thing's happening here. The Israelites are crying out after 20 years being oppressed. And I always think, like, when I read that, like, 20 years being oppressed, okay. And 20 seems like such a small number when you think of, like, all the numbers in the Bible, right? And, like, thousands of years. But think about that. Like, you're oppressed cruelly for 20 years. Like, that's a long time in reality. And so the Israelites cry out, and God raises up Deborah as a leader. So Julia just typed in, wondering if there's also something going on here with cleanliness rules, right, and women being unclean. So that is another thought about why women weren't allowed to specifically touch things related to war, because of specific cleanliness rules that would theoretically then make those armor, those weapons unclean, and then you'd have to get them, like, sort of blessed and cleansed. And that is definitely another theory. So it's not something that is, like, really popping up in this verse or in this passage as far as I see it, but it's definitely another theory about like why women in general weren't allowed to be involved with war stuff. So yes, thank you for bringing that up. So then what happens is Deborah's sitting here under the palm of Deborah, and she's judging, and God speaks to her and says, all right, we're going to get this ball rolling. We have to free the Israelites from this Canaanite king. So she calls to Barak, son of Abinoam, whose name I always want to mispronounce. But Barak, we often, if you've heard this story before, and if you're familiar with this story at all, we often think of Barak as like the Israelite general who has it all together. He like knows about military stuff. He's a good military leader. The interesting thing about this is we have no background on Barak at all. We don't know where he came from. We don't know, well, not at all. We know who his father was. That's about all we've got. And so because we don't have a lot of info about Barak, we kind of have assumed that he's already like the military leader of Israel, but that might not be true. Barak could have just been like some random dude out, like, I mean, God picked David off of, herding sheep and was like, you're going to be the king now. It would not be unlike God to pick some random shepherd and be like, you're going to lead the military now. So we don't really know what's going on with Barak or where he comes from or how much experience he has as a military leader. But Deborah calls for him, and Deborah says, the Lord the God of Israel commands you, take a position at Mount Tabor and bring all these warriors from these two tribes. And God says, I will draw out the enemy general, Sisera, and I will meet you, and I'm going to give the enemy general into your hand. So to give you a little bit of like structure of how this battle is going, because it's kind of, there's a lot of names here. You're like, okay, Mount Tabor, Wadi Kishon, like what's going on? Where is this? Basically, the way this looks is, God has said, you take all the troops and you go up on top of this mountain, and a wadi is a river valley, usually a dry river valley. And so, or not dry like bone dry, but dry like there isn't a huge river there. So God says, take all the men, get them all armored up, go to the top of Mount Tabor, and then I'm going to lead the enemy general and his army through the river valley, and you're going to come down and attack them. So that's kind of, God's going to like sneakily get the enemy general and his army into the river valley. Now, the other interesting thing about this particular plan that God has set up is that what is the Canaanite king known for in his army? We're told in verse 3 that he has 900 chariots of iron. So he's got all these heavy-wheeled chariots. Pretty brilliant of God as a strategist to be like, I'm going to take them through the semi-dry river valley where all their wheels are going to get stuck. So like the enemy general, Sisera, you would imagine, would not normally go through like muddy-ish river valley because he's got all these chariots. It wouldn't make a lot of sense. So I'm sure at this point that Barak is thinking like, okay, God, how are you going to get them to show up in this valley so we can attack? Because like, who's going to take all their chariots through this muddy valley where they're going to get stuck? You can imagine Barak was probably thinking something along those lines. So that's kind of where we're set up, is God's like setting up this whole battle plan. This is how it's going to go. And Barak says to Deborah, he says, if you go with me, I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. And Deborah says, I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. So Deborah's like, okay, you're clearly a little bit nervous about this. Maybe it's your first time leading an army. We don't know. And also a little bit like, how is God going to get this army to go in a really non-defendable spot? Like, it's not smart for them to go into this river valley. So Barak's a little bit nervous maybe, or he just thinks like, hey, it's a really good idea to bring the prophet of God along with you. Understandably, probably a good idea. So Barak says, come with me, Deborah. And Deborah's like, okay, 100% for sure. Now, like I said, we don't have a specific verse that tells us like what Deborah wore, right? We don't have a verse to tell us like, and then Deborah put on all the armor she needed to go to the battlefield. We don't have a verse that says that. But it's also kind of wild that Deborah goes with at all to this battle when she's not technically, according to the social rules of the day around gender, she's not supposed to be leading an army. She's not supposed to be going to battle, right? This is not women's work. This is men's stuff. And yet, how many times are we told that Deborah is going to this battle, right? So look at this. So Barak says, will you go with me? And she says, I will surely go, right? And then Deborah got up and went. And then Deborah went up with him, right? So 3 times we're told in the space of like 3 verses, we're told Deborah is for sure going to the battlefield with Barak. So given those sort of like, those sort of repetitions about Deborah saying like, I'm gonna go, and then it being like Deborah went, for sure she really did go. This whole thing is setting Deborah up to be in a place where women aren't supposed to be. And that in itself, regardless of what she wore, is sort of bending the rules of gender about who's allowed to do what. The fact that Deborah is directing this whole thing, like God is telling Deborah what to do, and then Deborah is directing the whole thing, Barak is not in charge here. And Deborah makes that very clear. She's like, the glory for this is not going to go to you, it's going to go to a woman, right? And Barak doesn't say anything to that, which is kind of cool. Barak doesn't speak up and say like, okay, sure, whatever, and, you know, like, or he doesn't talk back to Deborah. He clearly knows she's in charge. So we've got this very cool woman going to the battlefield, and that's where we left off in verse 10. So all the warriors get up and they go to the top of Mount Heber, and that's where we're kind of stopping for a second. Now for the next, 2 verses? No, it's just 1 verse. The next 1 verse here, we have a change of scenery. So first of all, we've been kind of like on the looking at the palm of Deborah, and then we're looking at Mount Tabor as all the people are like lining up and ready to go to battle. And now we're getting a sudden, like the camera is tilting to somebody else for a second here for verse 11. And verse 11 says, now Heber the Kenite had separated from the other Kenites, that is, the descendants of Hobab, the father-in-law of Moses, and had encamped as far away as Bezananim, there we go, which is near Kadesh. So, for 1 tiny verse, we get a weird pan over to this guy named Heber, who has split up from the rest of his family and is living very near the battle site. So, we're told, like, hey, just so you know, this guy and his family are camping near the battle site, right? So this is a little bit of a foreshadowing moment, so we know that they're there. So remember them for a second. I want to look at what Carolyn just wrote here. Carolyn says, Barak's reply of, if you go with me, I'll go, kind of reminds me of Ruth and Naomi, when Ruth said she would go with Naomi. Yeah, that I can see that for sure. That sense of like, like the asking for somebody to come with you and the sort of affirmation of that. I can definitely see that. I like that connection, Carolyn. I hadn't thought of that. So, hold on. Aw, hi Nikki, bye Nikki, have a good meeting. So we've had this moment of like, whoosh, okay, we're over here now. We know that Heber and his family is living near Mount Tabor, right? So then, in the next verse, we are going to read, let's read verses 12 through 16 next. Actually, we have to stop on verse 12 for a second, and then we'll go on. Verse 12 says, when Sisera was told that Barak, son of Abinoam, had gone up to Mount Tabor. Now let's pause for a second there. When Sisera, the enemy general, was told about all this, like these troops amassing on top of Mount Tabor, that bit there, when Sisera was told, is interesting because we could read that as when Sisera was told, in which case we're like, well, who told Sisera? Like, who told him? Who like let him know what was going on, right? However, you can also read the way that this Hebrew sentence is structured to connect to the previous verse, to say, when Heber told Sisera that Barak had gone up with the soldiers to Tabor. So that verse 11, when we have like the whoosh over here to Heber's family, it might not just be to remind us that they're there for later. It might also be to say Heber himself was the one who told Sisera what was going on. Why would Heber do that? Well, basically, Heber's family, we got a little bit of his genealogy there. Heber's family is not an Israelite family. He's like a way back relative of Moses, but he's not he doesn't, like, he's not part of the Israelite community. He's also not technically part of this enemy Canaanite community. He's like an objective third party, basically. He's not involved in this battle. So why would Heber tell Sisera what's going on? Why would he let slip that this Israelite army was amassing? Well, basically because, and this is like, I'm taking a guess here, I'm putting thoughts into Heber's head here, but if you are a sort of neutral third party and you see a war happening, you want to get yourself on the good side of whoever you think is going to win. So if Heber goes to Sisera and he's like, yes, okay, Sisera has more people and he has 900 iron chariots, he's for sure going to win. I'm going to go give him some information about what's going on with those Israelites, because then, once he wins, he'll thank me. He'll give me stuff. I will have his favor, right? So that's probably what's going on with Heber here, is that Heber is the one who tells Sisera what's happening. So that was verse 12. So let's go 13 through 16. So Sisera knows what's going on, knows about Mount Tabor. Sisera calls out all his chariots, 900 chariots of iron, and all the troops who were with him, from Harosheth Hagoyim to the Wadi Kishon. Then Deborah said to Barak, "Up, for this is the day on which the Lord has given Sisera into your hand. The Lord is indeed going out before you." So Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 warriors following him, and the Lord threw Sisera and all his chariots and all his army into a panic before Barak. Sisera got down from his chariot and fled away on foot, while Barak pursued the chariots and army to Harosheth Hagoyim. All the army of Sisera fell by the sword. No one was left. So we've got the actual battle happening in these verses. We've got Barak and the warriors coming down from the mountain. And so here we're told Deborah is with them, right? She gives the order to attack, but then we're not told that she actually goes down the mountain and kills people. So that's kind of like where Deborah holds up, is on top of the mountain. So they go down. The Lord throws Sisera's army into a panic, which again is very similar to what happened with the escape from Egypt, right? In the Egypt story, the people are led to the edge of the Red Sea, and then they're like, oh no, what are we going to do? And the Lord throws the Egyptian armies into a terror, right? So the same thing happens here. So God has sneakily, maybe through Heber, gotten Sisera and the army to go into this valley, and then God panics them, and theoretically, probably a lot of them get stuck. So they totally win the day. Barak's army wins, and everybody is killed except for Sisera. Sisera is the one person who gets away. And Sisera, he runs off, right? So that's kind of where the end of the battle is right there. So the last thing that happens is we are suddenly introduced to a new character. So let's read verses to the end of the chapter, verses 17 through 24. Now Sisera had fled away on foot to the tent of Jael, wife of Heber the Canaanite. For there was a peace between King Jabin of Hazor and the clan of Heber the Canaanite. Jael came out to meet Sisera and said to him, "Turn aside, my lord, turn aside to me, have no fear." So he turned aside to her into the tent, and she covered him with a rug. Then he said to her, "Please give me a little water to drink, for I am thirsty." So she opened a skin of milk and gave him a drink and covered him. He said to her, "Stand at the entrance of the tent, and if anybody comes and asks you, 'Is anyone here?' say, 'No.'" But Jael, wife of Heber, took a tent peg and took a hammer in her hand and went softly to him and drove the peg into his temple until it went down into the ground. He was lying fast asleep from weariness, and he died. Then as Barak came in pursuit of Sisera, Jael went out to meet him and said to him, "Come and I will show you the man you are seeking." So he went into her tent, and there was Sisera lying dead with the tent peg in his temple. So on that day, God subdued King Jabin of Canaan before the Israelites. Then the hand of the Israelites bore harder and harder on King Jabin of Canaan until they destroyed him. So that's the end of that chapter. A wild and bloody chapter for sure. So let's talk about Jael for a second here, because Jael is another fascinating character in this story. So Jael sees Sisera running away from the battlefield, and put yourself in Jael's place for a second. And this is actually a question that I want to ask you all in the chat. When Jael sees Sisera running away from the battlefield, Jael says, "Come into my tent," right? Jael says, "Come over here and I'm going to keep you safe." And she covers him with a rug and she gives him something to drink. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Like, we think the reason that she gave him milk instead of water, one of the reasons people think that happened is because milk is like a more luxurious thing than water is, and so she's being like an especially good host. This is like incredible hospitality that she's showing. And then, as soon as he falls asleep for his little nap, tucked up in his rug after he's had some warm milk, she drives a tent peg through his head and kills him, right? With such force that it goes down into the ground underneath his head, right? That is an intense hammer that Jael went for there. So putting yourself in Jael's shoes here, keeping this stuff in mind, right? Keeping in mind, she's not, as far as we know, she's not an Israelite. She's not a Canaanite. She's, again, this third party, right? She's the wife of Heber. And we don't know if she knew that her husband was sort of trying to get favor with the Canaanite king. But we are told that, like, their family was pretty close with the king, right? They were trying to be close to the king. So why would somebody who is not an Israelite and is like, you know, might know that her husband is trying to get on the king's good side and get on Sisera's good side even, why would she kill Sisera? That's the question that I want to put to you all. So let me know in the chat why you think Jael killed Sisera in this moment. What good did it do her? What do you think she was supposed to get out of it? Sydney says, well, hubby clearly fouled up this bet. Better fix it. It could be. It could be that Jael saw the enemy general running for his life and was like, well, clearly the Israelites have won. Maybe we better endear ourselves to the Israelites rather than the Canaanite king. That could definitely be a possibility. Mary, Jael, I saw an opportunity and I took it. Yeah, so this could be like a calculating moment, right? Where she's like, okay, maybe we need to get ourselves on the Israelites' good side instead. Are there any more thoughts about why Jael might have done this? Something that is almost certainly going to make her husband really mad, that she kind of went against his plan. Something that might mean that, she's risking the fact that she might then, at that point, live in a land where neither the Israelites nor the Canaanites want anything to do with them, and they make them move. She's risking a lot with this move, with this sort of gamble that she's taking. Are there any more thoughts on why she would do this? I'm going to have another drink while y'all think. So, here's my theory. And again, who knows? We don't really know why she did it. But what if Jael, who she and her husband had lived in this land for a while, as far as we know. Hold on a second before I give my theory. Ellis says, often in the Old Testament there are characters who seem to have insight about the specialness or blessedness of Israel despite being an outsider. I kind of see Jael as one of those characters like Rahab. That's a great one, Ellis. That's a good possibility. So Rahab is another awesome woman in the Bible who helped some Israelite soldiers, even though she wasn't an Israelite. So yeah, could be that she's one of those people that is like, okay, Israel's clearly a big deal. I have no idea why, but I'm going to help them. Definitely a possibility. Ooh, Carolyn says, I just looked up this passage on ATLA, and one paper refers to her as a death mother. And from scanning the paper, Jael's actions mirror that of a mother. That's actually a big thing in scholarship of this passage. Is some scholars look at this and see Jael giving Sisera milk and tie this into, and like giving him milk and tucking him in and sort of setting Jael up as this mother figure who is then dangerous. And you could, I'm sure there have been, I haven't actually seen one of these, but you could write a whole paper on like feminist interpretation of that interpretation, the fact that like mothers are secretly dangerous to men of power. You could write a whole thing on that, and I would love to read it if it hasn't already been written. But that is definitely, I know, death mother sounds so metal, Mary says. That is definitely an interpretation. Another interesting interpretation of what Jael does with the tent peg, with Jael driving the tent peg through Sisera's skull, another interpretation I've read is that it is a reverse, and this is, I should put a trigger warning here about sexual assault. I will only mention it briefly. But there's another theory that this is a reverse sexual assault or reverse rape situation where Jael is the one sort of like I mean, it's a stake. It's a phallic object, right? Driving it through Sisera's head. And the people that have read that particular interpretation also sort of put in the background of like, what if Jael had been sexually assaulted by members of the Canaanite king's military? Because this is a military that's kind of like, they kind of get to do what they want. So what if Jael had been on the sort of end of that kind of power abuse and dynamic, maybe even from Sisera himself? So that's another possible interpretation of that text. But those are all, possible interpretations. I'm really glad that you all have these different ideas here. Ella says, I'm sure there's a lot of great feminist theory about the intersection of mothers and danger coming from literary studies, especially. Definitely. And especially, I just happen to know this, even though I hate horror movies. The idea of the deadly, scary mother in horror movies is a whole thing in and of itself. So I'm sure that there's a ton out there. I've just never seen it applied to this particular story in that way. So I would be interested in that. Amory says, women in the Hebrew Bible often act subversively to achieve God's ends. Very true, Amory. And I think that's really what I wanted to focus on with Deborah, especially, is she's bending the rules around gender and what she is and isn't supposed to do, but it's because God has called her to liberate the people, right? And liberation of the Israelite people is maybe more important than everybody sticking to their gender boxes. So, Amory, you kind of made my point for me there. Carolyn says, yes. Okay, cool. So Carolyn's giving us an interesting resource for a paper to read about for those of us that have ATLA access. Jenny says, is it a normal thing for wives such as Jael to travel with her husband during battle? So Jael and Heber, her husband, weren't traveling. They lived near where the battle happened to be. So it wasn't that they were traveling together. It was their camp just happened to be set up next to Mount Tabor, which is where this battle happened. So they weren't going anywhere. They lived there. So let me give you my theory on maybe what Jael might have been, maybe why she killed Sisera. And it could be any of these reasons, right? Any of the things we've already talked about. But I like to think of Jael as somebody who had lived in the region for a while and who saw the way that the Israelites were oppressed for 20 years and decided that even though it was going against her husband's wishes and even though it might get her in trouble, that it was worth it to her to try to be part of the liberation of those oppressed people. And maybe that's giving her too much credit. I don't know. It could be that she really was just well, the other side won, so let's ingratiate ourselves to them. That could very well be it. But I love the idea of Jael, of this woman saying, I know all the plans that everybody's set up, but I've seen how poorly these people have been treated, and this is the enemy general that was part of treating them poorly, so I'm going to be part of this liberation effort. I'm going to do my own version of going to battle, what I'm allowed to do. One of the interesting things about Jael using that tent peg to kill Sisera rather than a knife, right? Because there would have been knives around. She lived in a tent, right? There would have been knives for cutting fruit and meat and all kinds of stuff. She could have used a knife. She could have used, if there was a sword laying around, theoretically, she could have used that. But instead, she uses a tent peg. And something that's interesting about that is that interpreters, the same interpreters that talk about how women aren't supposed to go into battle and aren't supposed to wear men's clothing because of the battle connotations, they talk about how Jael used the tent peg specifically so that she could follow those gender rules, because a tent peg was a feminine implement because women were the homemakers, right? Women were the ones that lived in tents and put up tents and did tent things. So by using a tent peg to kill Sisera, Jael is doing something with the weapon that is allocated to her gender role. So people kind of look at this story as a story of Deborah, who seems to bend gender roles, and Jael, who seems to stay within her assigned box, but does something with it that surprises people and that is maybe not sanctioned by the men around her. So, fascinating story with Jael and Deborah. It's also important to notice that when Deborah says at the very beginning of this passage that God will sell Sisera, the enemy general, into the hand of a woman, when you first read the story, you think it's going to mean into the hand of Deborah, right? But at the end of the story, we find out it's into the hand of Jael, right? Jael is the one who wins this battle. She's the one that gets the glory for the battle. And she wasn't even in the battle. She's just a woman that lives nearby. So it's fascinating to me that Jael ends up being in the battle even though she's not in the battle, and she's the one that gets all the glory for it. Mary says, this conversation is so meta. It really is, I know. So I want us to turn just for a second to chapter 5, which is the song that I talked about. This is the song version of this story. And I want to just look at two things here. Well, actually, let's just look at one thing here. I want to look at the way that Jael is pictured in this song. So let's read chapter 5, verses 24 through 26. Most blessed of women be Jael, the wife of Heber the Canaanite, of tent-dwelling women most blessed. He asked water, and she gave him milk. She brought him curds in a lordly bowl. She put her hand to the tent peg and her right hand to the workman's mallet. She struck Sisera a blow. She crushed his head. She shattered and pierced his temple. Can you imagine singing that in like a really rollicking like bar song kind of way? I don't know what the tune was, but that's the way I kind of imagine it. So in the song that happens in the next chapter, Jael is given so much of the glory for this battle. She's the one that kills Sisera, the enemy general. I also am fascinated by the fact that in this particular version of the story, in verse 26, it says that she's using her right hand, put her right hand to the workman's mallet, which would have been a male implement. So in the chapter 5 version of the story, it is a more masculine thing that she uses. So anyway, interesting stuff around Jael there in the next song. Melissa says, the part in Deborah's song about the scene with Jael is very interesting, very visually descriptive. Exactly. It's very like, it's really, she did this. She really did it. She really, really did it. They're really trying to get their point across in that song. So I've got a couple questions to ask all of you folks as we're thinking about this passage. First of all, have you ever heard this story, the story of Deborah and the story of Jael? Have you ever heard it before in church or in any sort of Christian education setting? And did you ever think about it as the story of people who are kind of bending gender roles? Is that something that you've heard before or not? Because I think it's a real shame that a lot of us never heard this story. And obviously, like, the part with Jael and the tent peg, that's really something that you it's not something you're going to teach little kids. But the earlier part with Deborah and the battle is something that we could teach in Sunday school, and we don't. And it's such a bummer because she's such an interesting person, and we have so few women in the Bible to lift up, even for cis folks, for cis women, that it's a shame that we don't talk about her more. Bluefoot says, I have in church, and Julia says no. Robin says, I hadn't heard of it in church, but I read it and was fascinated by it. Stephanie says, I haven't heard it before. Yeah, it's so wild that we, like, how many women are there in the Bible and we don't hear about these two women, right? I don't know, it just seems wild. Sydney says, yes, but in a slightly more muted context vis-a-vis gender role reversal. Yeah, so this is another thing. For folks that are, like, real into gender complementarity and gender roles, there's a whole side of this where people go, Barak wasn't living up to what he should have been as a manly man. Barak should have taken charge. Barak should have been like, I'm the guy and I'm going to war and I'm going to do it by myself. And the fact that he asked Deborah for help is seen as like weak, which is wild to me. What are we teaching our men? That's nuts that you can't ask a woman for help. Wild. Anyways, that's definitely a way that it's read. So if you've heard it read that way before, I hope maybe this complicated that reading a little bit. Carolyn says, I've heard it in a feminist Bible study a month ago and gender roles were discussed. Oh, good. Oh, yeah. So Amory's connecting it to Judith as well, another woman. Yes. Jude says, I'd heard the story but hadn't considered it as gender bending roles, but I had heard the essay bit before. Yeah, fair. Robin said, the tent peg thing was so surprising to me the first time I read it. Yeah, right? Like, you don't expect that. Just like, she says, come in and hang out, and he lies down, has some milk, gets rolled up in a rug, and you're like, okay, that must be the end of the story. And then death. It just comes out of nowhere. Carolyn says, I also heard it in Sunday school when I went to an Episcopal church when I was 6, and Deborah was a role model alongside Miriam. That is awesome! Good job to that church for bringing those up. Ellis, yeah, I agree. The text doesn't degrade Barak for that. So, okay, here's what I want to ask about Barak. This is another question I want to put to us all. Hang on, I've got it. Okay, so one of the things that I think about Barak is that he is actually a really great example of what allyship looks like. Because what happens is Deborah, because of the societal construct around gender, she can't like kill people in battle. She can't take up a sword and kill people in battle, which is what like how the Israelites are being liberated, right? So she asks Barak to do this with her and for her, right? And Barak, first of all, never takes the spotlight for himself, and second of all, doesn't tell her what she's supposed to be doing, right? Barak does the thing that he's asked to do, and he doesn't make it all about himself. I think Barak is a really great example of what allyship can look like. And so I wonder how we can be more like Barak. How are there ways when God calls somebody to do something and then they ask us for help, how can we not make it all about us? And so I wonder if it's possible to see Barak in a super positive light, not as somebody who like fails to man up and take charge, but as somebody who is like, who recognizes that God put Deborah in charge. If Barak had come over and tried to take charge of the situation, he would have ruined the whole thing. God didn't ask Barak, God asked Deborah, right? So I wonder how we can think about Barak as like a positive example of allyship and what that looks like. Sydney says, the teaching I received was almost that Barak was punished for his unbelief or unmanliness by God giving the victory instead to a woman. Exactly. Yeah, there's a, the way that Deborah says that is not, there's nothing in the text itself, there's nothing in the Hebrew that suggests that she's trying to shame him. That is not in the text. But I think what happens is you read the text with your lens, right? So if you are a man who believes that men should be in charge and that men are the ones that need to be doing all the battling, if you read that sentence, you read it as Deborah judging him. You read it as like, well, if you're not man enough to do it, then God's going to give the battle to a woman, right? But there's nothing in the text that says that. And I think there are way more ways to read that than that particular lens. Julia just pointed out that listening to people is a great way to act like Barak in this situation, to actually listen to what people ask you to do, to listen to what people are directed to, or what people are directing you to do. I don't know about you all, but I've definitely had this problem before where I like get into a situation where I've like come to help and then I immediately accidentally try to take something over. Just because I'm like, oh, I can do that. And if I were Barak, I feel like I would have gotten myself into some trouble there. Because think about it, like even Deborah gives the order to attack on the top of Mount Tabor. She says, up Israel, it's time to attack, right? Barak could have been the one to give that. Barak could have said, you know what, Deborah, I asked you to come here. Thank you very much. You just stand over there and I'm going to direct. But he doesn't do that. He lets Deborah speak. And in fact, other than that moment where Barak says, I need you to come with me, Barak doesn't speak. Barak just does what he's asked to do, and he doesn't make it all about himself. So I appreciate Barak in that moment. So, oh shoot, I have so many more questions for you all. I got so into the story. This story is something that has a lot of violence in it, right? It's a story that, like, we've got a battle, and then we've got a guy getting staked in the head. So we've got a lot of violence happening here. And I wonder, I think this is a question that we're all asking ourselves right now, is how much violence is allowable for freedom? And none of us have the answer to this question. And I think probably there's a lot of context that needs to be taken into consideration. But like, the quest here was to free the Israelites from oppression. The whole point was to free the Israelites from an oppressive regime that had ruled them cruelly for 20 years, right? How much violence is necessary or allowable to get out from that and to get freedom? That's a question I think we should ask every time we see a Bible story where a lot of people die, especially if it's sort of for a good cause. Like, if you're like me, you read that battle story and you're like, hooray, the Israelites win, they get free. And even in the like weird gut-churning weirdness of the Jael bit, you still kind of go, good for her. And then you realize, like, yeah, but people died. And so I think one thing, and this is not a question that I wonder if you all have an answer for, but I think it's something that we need to think about. Because clearly there were some things that needed to change, and at this point in the world, the way that happened was through a battle, and so that's what happened. But I also think about the fact that any of those Canaanite soldiers who were part of Sisera's army could have at any point said, you know what? We outmatched the Israelite army. We have 900 iron chariots, and we have way more people than them. We far outmatched them. We've been oppressing them forever. They are no threat to us. Any of those people could have at any point said, you know what? I'm out. I don't want to attack these people. There's no honor in it. I don't want to go after this small community of people that we've been oppressing. At any point, any of those soldiers could have put down their weapons and said, I'm out. And they didn't. And then the Israelite army just sort of barreled through them. And so it makes me wonder about not just like how much violence is okay for liberation, but also it makes me think about the times when we might accidentally be the soldiers that are looking at the people who we've oppressed for so long, and we don't realize that we have a choice to stand down and put our weapons down. We don't realize that if we're on the oppressing side, we could stop this by just putting our weapons down and not being part of it anymore. So that's just something I've been thinking about with this particular story. So the last question I want us to sort of think about is how might we, and this is actually a question for you all, do you think this is a story that we could talk about more in Christian circles, and where and when do you think we could talk about it? Because like I said, you maybe don't want to come up with the tent peg through the skull thing for like second grade Sunday school kids, although some of them might think it's very cool. But where and when do you think we should be telling this story? Because it's a story with so much nuance, and it's a story with a lot of interesting gender stuff going on, and it's a story of two really badass women, and we want to lift those up in the Bible. So where and when do you think we could tell this story more? Would you like to hear it preached about more? This is not a story that almost ever gets preached on, at least in mainline churches and Catholic churches, because it doesn't show up. I think it shows up one time in the lectionary. So maybe some preaching, maybe some Sunday school stuff with older kids, maybe some adult Bible studies. Where do you think we could tell these stories more so that more people know about them? Julia says, I wish a lot of people would put their weapons down. Yeah, I feel that. I think this is a story that I wish we would talk about more. I think maybe more in sermons and more in church in general, like for adult stuff, because it is complicated and there's a lot to it, and maybe it's too adult in some ways. But I don't think we should not talk about it because it's complicated, right? Ella says, I think high school Bible study is a good time for it. Teens like the edginess of it. Yeah. Oh my gosh. The first time I heard this story was in, I think, my sophomore year of high school. We looked at it very briefly as part of a Bible study in high school. And in the same Bible study, we looked at the story of, it's in Judges, but I don't remember who it was, that there's somebody who kills a king essentially while he's sitting on the toilet and like stabs him through the stomach. And it's very gory, and we learned that story in the same Bible study, and all the teenagers were like, oh, that's so metal. And we didn't really talk about the dealing with the violence of it all. But yeah, teenagers like the edginess sometimes. Jude says, I honestly want to hear the essay interpretation in full sometime because I always run into it in brief. Jude, if you send me a message somewhere, I will see if I can try to send you some of the information I have on that. Robin says, I think a Bible study or Sunday school would be the most appropriate since it requires some nuance and discussion. Agreed. Julia says, I don't see it preached in a conservative setting. Yeah, it's in the settings where I have heard it preached in those particular places, it's tended to be about the gender role thing, about like Barak needs to man up and Deborah needs to know her place. So it's complicated there for sure. Stephanie says, I would like to hear it during a church sermon. So would I. Jude says, I generally hearing more about Deborah, more to the point where I can actually track who is who would be cool. I know, there's a lot of characters here. Sydney says, definitely teens. I really wish that it had been covered better than it was in my military officers and spouses Bible study because military men especially could use the lesson on being a good ally to women. For sure. Like, essentially what you've got set up here is like a woman SO and a guy who's like good at taking orders from her and not being a jerk. So I can see that. Ella says, I just remembered my high school Bible study that I read it with was one where we were going through all of Judges chapter by chapter. Judges is full of metal stories. It is indeed. There's a lot of people die in Judges. It is probably the bloodiest book in Scripture, I would argue. But yeah, it's intense. Carolyn says, I know I mainly hear about it in feminist context, and I kind of wish I heard it more on its own, instead just that here's a woman in the Bible leading setting I hear it in. Yeah, I get that. That's a good point, Carolyn. Well, thank you all for being here for Bible study tonight. This was really fun. I know that I talked more than usual this time. Usually I try to be more dialogue-y with you all, and this time I was just so into like explaining what was happening in the story that I know I talked a lot. So I hope you'll forgive me for that. But thank you for sharing your thoughts and your ways of thinking about this story and where we can think more about it. I really appreciate it. You all are great. Updates for what's going on next. If you are not already, get signed up for our workshop that is happening on Wednesday night. It's very exciting. We're doing a unpacking religious trauma workshop on Wednesday night, and so if you're interested in that at all, I'm going to put the link in the text box right now in the chat, and then you will have it. Copy this link. All right. There we go. So if you want to get signed up for our Wednesday, our Wednesday workshop, it's going to be really awesome. And we have we have 2 support groups happening this week, tomorrow and Thursday, so you can get signed up for those on our website. And our next Bible study will be on, wait for it, let me look at the calendar. Our next Bible study will be on August 10th, will be the next one. So until then, I'm going to put this in the chat there so everybody has it. And we will see you next time, everybody. Thanks again for being here. See you later, everyone.